Hi, this is Julie Harland, and I'm your Math Gal. Please visit my website at yourmathgal.com, where you could search for any of my videos organized by topic. We're going to work on some percent applications, and we're going to do these three problems in this video. So here's the first one. A 60-ounce bottle of mixed juice states that 30% is apple juice. How many ounces of apple juice are in the bottle? Now, there are different ways that you can figure out this problem. One is to use the basic idea of percent. If 30% of a 60-ounce bottle is apple juice, you know that that's what you're looking for, 30% of 60. Now, I know it's 60 ounces, but I'm going to leave off that part and just have the numbers here now. And then how do you do 30% of 60? Well, there's more than one way of doing it. You can either change 30% to a decimal or a fraction. That's one way of doing it. So let's say I change it to a decimal. And it says of 60, so we're going to multiply. Right? And then how do you multiply 0.3 times 60 without a calculator? If you have a calculator, you could do it that way as well. You just do 3, you ignore the decimal point for the moment. You do 3 times 60, which is 3 times 6 with the extra 0. And then you need to move the decimal in one place. So it's 18. So 30% of 60 is 18. Now you could have also done this with a fraction as well. Now that's one way of getting how much apple juice, pure apple juice basically, is in this mixed juice bottle. Now here's another way of thinking about it. It says 30% is apple juice. So if you've got 60 ounces, 10% of 60, most people can figure out. You just move the decimal 1 to the left, is 6 ounces, right? So if that's 10%, 30% would be 3 times that. Or it would be 10% plus another 10% plus another 10%. So you add 6, 6, and 6, which is 3 times 6. So if 10% of 60 is 6, then 30% of 60 would be 3 times 6. And you're still going to get 18 ounces. So, by the way, there isn't just one way to figure out this answer. Now, in a math class, this is the most common way you would do it, the way I did it the first way. So there's 18 ounces of apple juice. But in reality, a lot of people figure out things differently without using any piece of paper at all. They could do this in their head. Here's another one. In a survey of 1,280 college students, 5% said they called home daily. How many students call home daily? All right, well, we've got 1,280 college students and 5% call home, and that's what we're looking for. How many? So again, that just means 5% of 1,280. And again, you can change this 5% to a decimal or a fraction. You could use a calculator, or you could do it out, doing regular old multiplication, side work. So, oops, this is not 0.5, it's 0.05, right? Because you have to move the decimal 2 to the left. And so then we multiply this out, and you should get 64. Okay, so if you use a calculator, you can get 64. If you got out a piece of paper and did the long multiplication, you should get 64. So 64 students call home daily, right? But again, somebody might think about it a little bit differently. They say, well, I'm trying to figure out 5%. Is it easy to figure out what 10% of it is? What's 10% of 1,280? Well, that would mean move the decimal 1 to the left. It would just be 128. So if 10% is 128, 5% is half of that, right? So that's just half of 128, which is 64. So I'm just showing you how You might think about it a little bit differently. You might be able to do this without even a piece of paper. This first way I'm showing you is more, let's see, algebraic almost in nature, right? The way most teachers teach you how to do things. And yet, most people sometimes can figure out things in their head without writing anything down, especially if they're easy numbers like 10, 20, 30% or 5%, not so difficult. So it's just nice to know there are alternatives. And here's our last one for this video. A brand of non-fat yogurt has 20% fewer calories than the same brand of low-fat yogurt, which has 120 calories. All right, so this is saying there's some low-fat yogurt that has 120 calories. Okay, and we know the non-fat has 20% fewer calories. How many calories are in the non-fat yogurt? Well, this could be written as a two-step problem, and then I'll show you how you could get this in one step as well. And how you could, actually, there's a lot of other ways you might figure out this. So a brand of non-fat yogurt has 20% fewer calories than the low-fat, which has 120. So the common way for people to do this is figure out how many fewer calories by saying, well, what is 20% of 120? And 20% could be written as a fraction or as a decimal. I'm going to just do it as 0.2 times 120. And the way I do this is without a calculator. I think 2 times 120 is 240, and I move the decimal in 1. So I know there's going to be 24. Okay? But that just tells me how many fewer calories. So the total number of calories, the calories in the non-fat yogurt, you have to subtract that from the 120. 120 minus 24, right? So that's the number of calories in the non-fat yogurt. So there's the traditional way of doing this problem. Now another way, remember this 20%, I said some people might think of that as, well, what is 20% of 120? And they easily figure out what 10% is. 10% of 120 is 24, right? I'm sorry, is 12. You have the decimal in 1. So 20% is twice as much, right? So that's another way that you could figure out what 20% of 120 is. It's 24. And then you'd still subtract it from the 96, right? So you could either do 0.2 times 120, 1/5 times 120, figure out what 10% is, double it. But in any case, you're going to get that 20% of 120 is 24 and subtract it from 120. Right? This is a traditional way of doing it. But now I want you to think about it just slightly differently. If it has 20% fewer calories, all right, that means it still has 80% of the original calories. Think about that. It's got 20% fewer, then the non-fat has 80% of the total calories in the low-fat yogurt. So another way to figure this out is to say, what is, how many there are all in one step. There's going to be 80% of the 120 calories, which is 0.8 times 120, which just gives you 96 calories. Notice the difference. In the first way I showed you, I'm figuring out 20% and then I have to subtract from 120. In the second way, I'm actually just figuring out how many in one step I'm figuring out the total number of calories in the non-fat yogurt. And in fact, this is the way I usually figure out discounts when I'm going to the store. Let me give you an example. So let's say I go to the store and they're having a 40% off sale, and I see a blouse for $15. I actually don't compute how much money I'm going to get off. I compute how much I'm going to have to pay for it. I know if it's 40% off, then it's 60% on. That's how I think about it. I'm going to have to pay 60%. So I don't have a piece of paper with me, right? I'm in the store. I think, what's 60% of 15? I ignore everything about decimals and I just think 6 times 15. Okay, I just think 6 times 15. Well, that's 90. And I know it's not going to be $90, so I know there must be some decimal point difference, and that's how I come up with $9. So that's the way I come up with it. I don't worry about the percents. I come up with what seems reasonable. So I think of what's on. Now, a lot of people do it the other way. They do 40% off, so they think what's 40% of 15, and that's $6, and then they have to take 15 minus 6. Again, you're going to get $9. So just gives you a different way of thinking about some problems when you have, let's say, a discount or you have fewer calories as in the last example, etc. Please visit my website at yourmathgal.com where you can view all of my videos which are organized by topic.